Every military commander in history has dreamed of defeating a stronger enemy without actually beating them in battle. Most never figure out how to do it. But one American general in 1780 pulled off something so counterintuitive, so psychologically demanding, and so strategically brilliant that military academies still study it today. He lost almost every single engagement he fought, and yet somehow, impossibly, he destroyed the most powerful army Britain had ever sent to American soil. This is the story of Nathanael Greene, the man who won by running. Let me set the scene for you, because the situation Greene walked into was genuinely catastrophic. By late 1780, the southern theatre of the American Revolution was not just struggling, it was collapsing. Charleston had fallen. The Continental Army in the south had been shattered at the Battle of Camden, where British General Lord Cornwallis crushed American forces so completely that it was considered one of the worst defeats in American military history. Thousands of soldiers captured, the commanding General Horatio Gates fleeing the battlefield on horseback so fast he covered 60 miles before stopping. The Continental Congress was horrified. The South looked finished. Into this disaster walked a 38-year-old former ironmaster from Rhode Island who had taught himself military strategy by reading books. Nathanael Greene had no formal military education. He had been turned down from his local militia because he walked with a slight limp. But George Washington, who had watched Greene closely throughout the early years of the war, trusted this man more than almost any other officer in the Continental Army. Washington sent Greene south in December 1780 with a simple and brutal mandate: fix it. With what? With the broken remnants of an army that barely existed anymore? Here is what Greene was facing. Cornwallis commanded a professional British and Hessian force, battle-hardened, well-supplied at least initially, and absolutely confident after their string of southern victories. These were not weekend soldiers. These were men who had been fighting wars professionally for years. They were disciplined, they were organized, and their commander was one of Britain's most aggressive and capable generals. Cornwallis was the kind of officer who went toward the fight. He wanted decisive engagements. He wanted to pin down the Americans, crush them, and end this rebellion once and for all in the South. Greene understood something that most commanders either could not see or could not accept emotionally. He did not need to beat Cornwallis. He needed to bleed him. And to do that, he needed to resist every single instinct that military glory and national pride were screaming at him to follow. That psychological discipline, the ability to retreat when everything in you wants to stand and fight, is actually one of the rarest and most difficult things a commander can possess. Most generals throughout history have destroyed themselves and their armies by refusing to run when running was the smart play. Greene made running into an art form. His strategy was what we would now call a war of attrition, but that phrase makes it sound passive. What Greene was doing was anything but passive. He was actively engineering a situation where every mile Cornwallis marched cost him something he could not replace. Every skirmish, every engagement, every chase through the Carolina backcountry was a calculated transaction. Greene was trading space for time, trading small losses for Cornwallis's larger, irreplaceable losses. He was thinking in a completely different framework than his opponent. The first and most audacious move Greene made after taking command was something that every conventional military textbook would tell you was suicidal. He divided his already tiny army. You are not supposed to split a weaker force in the face of a stronger enemy. You are supposed to concentrate your strength. Greene took his small force and split it into two separate commands. One portion he kept with himself. The other he gave to Daniel Morgan, a hard-fighting Virginian who was one of the best combat commanders in America. They moved in different directions, deep into British-controlled territory. Why would he do this? Think about it from Cornwallis's perspective. He now had two American forces operating independently in his area of operations. He had to respond to both of them. He could not ignore either one without risking a threat to his supply lines, his outposts, or his strategic position. So he was forced to divide his own attention and eventually his own forces. The Americans had just taken a numerically weaker situation and turned it into a strategic complication for the British. Cornwallis sent Banastre Tarleton, his most aggressive cavalry commander, after Morgan. What happened next became one of the most perfectly executed battles in American military history. At a place called Cowpens, in January 1781, Morgan turned and fought. But the way he fought was a masterpiece of psychology and battlefield geometry. He deliberately chose a position with a river at his back, eliminating any possibility of retreat for his own men. He arranged his troops in 3 lines. The front line of militia he told to fire just 2 shots and then fall back. Not run away in panic, but deliberately fall back. This was crucial because militia running was expected by the British. They had seen it at Camden and elsewhere. Tarleton's men saw the militia pulling back and charged forward with complete confidence. Then they ran straight into the 2nd and 3rd lines of Continental regulars who were waiting for them. The British force was effectively destroyed. Tarleton barely escaped with his life. Now Cornwallis was furious. He had lost a significant portion of his force, and his best cavalry commander had been humiliated. So he made the decision that Greene had been hoping he would make. He decided to pursue Morgan, and then Greene personally, to run them down, to force the decisive battle that would end this campaign. To speed up his pursuit, Cornwallis made an extraordinary and ultimately catastrophic decision. He burned most of his own supply wagons. He was going to turn his army into a lean, fast, hard-marching pursuit force. No more supplies slowing him down. He would live off the land and catch these Americans. This is the moment where Greene's strategy truly comes into focus. Because now Cornwallis was not just chasing Greene, he was chasing Greene while destroying his own logistical foundation. The British army in the Carolina backcountry of 1781 was not marching through friendly English countryside. They were moving through a vast, hostile wilderness of forests, swamps, rivers, and muddy roads that barely deserved the name. The terrain was brutal. Loyalist support was thinner than Cornwallis had been promised. The further north he pushed, the more attenuated his supply lines became, and he had just set fire to the wagons that were feeding and equipping his men. Greene ran. He ran brilliantly. His army covered extraordinary distances through extraordinarily difficult terrain, always staying just far enough ahead of Cornwallis to avoid being caught, never so far ahead that the British felt comfortable stopping the chase. This became known as the Race to the Dan, as Greene led Cornwallis on a grueling march toward the Dan River at the Virginia border. Greene had pre-positioned boats on the river. When his army crossed and the boats were pulled to the northern bank, Cornwallis stood on the southern shore and watched his prey escape. He had nothing. He could not cross. His army was exhausted, hungry, and hundreds of miles from any reliable source of supply. Think about what had just happened. Cornwallis had marched his elite professional army through hundreds of miles of hostile wilderness in winter conditions, burning his own supplies to do it, and he had nothing to show for it. No destroyed American army, no decisive victory, just tired, hungry soldiers standing in the mud, looking at a river they could not cross. The British army was being consumed not by enemy fire, but by the landscape itself, by the relentless pace of the chase, by the strategic trap that Greene had carefully constructed around them. But here is where people often misunderstand Greene's genius. He was not simply running away and hoping the British would get tired. He was running with a purpose, and when the moment was right, he turned back and fought. After crossing the Dan River and receiving reinforcements from Virginia, Greene reversed course and marched south again, back into North Carolina, back toward Cornwallis. This was the psychological masterstroke. Having chased Greene to the point of exhaustion, Cornwallis now found that Greene was coming back at him. The hunter was suddenly in a much more complicated position. The battle that resulted was Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, and it is one of the most fascinating engagements of the entire war, precisely because of how it was both a British tactical victory and a strategic catastrophe. Greene deliberately chose the ground and deliberately arranged his forces using a variation of the same layered defense Morgan had used at Cowpens. He placed his militia in forward lines, with instructions to fire and fall back, drawing the British forward through increasingly difficult fighting terrain. The British eventually held the field. By the technical definition of 18th century warfare, Cornwallis won. But look at the cost. Cornwallis lost roughly a quarter of his entire force, killed or wounded in that single engagement. A quarter. His army was not a huge force to begin with, and he had just traded away 25% of it to hold a piece of ground in the middle of North Carolina that had no particular strategic value. Charles James Fox, one of Britain's leading parliamentarians, stood up in the House of Commons after learning about Guilford Courthouse and delivered a line that cut straight to the truth. Another such victory, he said, would destroy the British army. Fox was right, and he articulated in one sentence exactly what Greene had understood from the beginning. Every engagement, whether Greene technically won or lost, was costing Cornwallis irreplaceable soldiers, irreplaceable officers, irreplaceable horses, irreplaceable equipment, and momentum. The British army could not absorb these losses the way a force fighting close to its own support network could. Every man who fell was a man who could not be replaced quickly. Every cannon captured or abandoned was a cannon gone. Every cavalry horse that dropped from exhaustion was a blow to British capability that echoed for weeks. After Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis made one of his most fateful decisions. He marched his weakened army to Wilmington, North Carolina, to rest and refit, essentially abandoning the interior of the Carolinas. And then, rather than returning to finish what he started, he marched north into Virginia, ostensibly to strike at American supply bases and ultimately to link up with other British forces. This decision, driven partly by frustration and partly by the genuine impossibility of the situation Greene had created in the Carolinas, would lead Cornwallis directly to Yorktown. But that is a story for another moment. What happened in the Carolinas after Cornwallis left is the part that history often glosses over, but which reveals the full scope of Greene's achievement. He turned south and began the systematic reduction of British outposts throughout South Carolina and Georgia. 96. Fort Mott, Fort Granby, Augusta. One after another, the British strongholds fell or were abandoned. Greene lost the major pitched battle he fought at Hobkirk's Hill. He failed to take 96 before British reinforcements arrived. He lost again at Eutaw Springs. 3 major engagements in the south after Guilford Courthouse, 3 tactical defeats for Greene, and yet, by the end of 1781, the British had been pushed back into Charleston and Savannah, clinging to the coast, their interior position completely collapsed. How does a general lose battle after battle and win a campaign? The answer lies in understanding what victory actually means at the strategic level. Greene was not fighting for terrain. He was not fighting for glory. He was fighting for the consumption of British resources and the erosion of British will and capability. Every battle he lost still cost the British more than they could afford in the long run. Every retreat he made pulled British forces further from their support. Every time he reconstituted his army and came back, he communicated to every loyalist, every neutral, every wavering colonial in the South that the British were not going to win this, that the Americans were not going away, that if you collaborated with the Crown and the British eventually lost, you would be on the wrong side of history. That last point matters enormously because the Southern campaign was not just a conventional military contest, it was also a battle for the political loyalty of the civilian population. Loyalists needed to believe Britain would protect them, or they would not risk supporting the Crown. Patriot militias needed to believe that the Continental Army would come back and that their sacrifices meant something. Greene's persistent, relentless, indestructible presence in the Southern theatre answered both of those political questions simultaneously. He was telling the South through his actions, not his words, that Britain could not hold this territory. And history proved him right. There is a moment in Greene's conduct of this campaign that I find particularly revealing about his character. After the race to the Dan, when he had just escaped across the river, and his men were exhausted, and his army was in rough shape, He wrote to his officers explaining why they needed to go back south, back toward Cornwallis, back into danger. Some of his officers were uncertain. The sensible thing might have been to stay in Virginia, gather strength, wait. Greene understood that waiting was its own kind of defeat. If he sat in Virginia, Cornwallis would consolidate, loyalists would gain confidence, patriot resistance would falter, and everything he had sacrificed to achieve would unravel. He went back. That decision, made in a moment of exhaustion and uncertainty, is what transformed a strategic retreat into a strategic victory. Military historians looking back at this campaign have consistently ranked Greene among the most gifted strategic minds of the 18th century. His campaign in the South is considered a model of what later theorists would call indirect warfare, the idea that you can defeat an enemy by attacking the conditions that support their power rather than attacking their power directly. He was not trying to kill every British soldier. He was trying to make the South ungovernable for the British, to make the cost of maintaining their position exceed any conceivable benefit, to create a situation where the rational British response was to leave. What makes this even more remarkable is the context in which Greene was operating. He had no reliable supply chain for most of his campaign. He was constantly begging the Continental Congress and state governments for food, clothing, weapons, and horses. His men marched in rags. They often went without adequate rations. He was fighting a sophisticated strategic campaign with tools that were barely adequate for a conventional one. The logistical challenges alone would have broken a lesser commander mentally. Greene kept going because he understood that his difficulties, while serious, were ultimately solvable problems, while Cornwallis's difficulties were structural, built into the very nature of what Britain was trying to do. Britain was attempting to hold an enormous territory, populated by increasingly hostile civilians, supplied across 3,000 miles of ocean, against an enemy that could always retreat, reconstitute, and return. The math of that equation never worked in Britain's favour, regardless of how many individual battles they won. Greene did not discover this problem, but he was the first American commander in the South who truly understood how to exploit it systematically and ruthlessly. There is something deeply counterintuitive about Greene's legacy that is worth sitting with for a moment. We celebrate military heroes for their great victories, for the decisive moments when they crushed the enemy and planted a flag. Greene's greatness looks almost nothing like that. His greatness was in the retreats he timed perfectly, in the battles he chose not to fight, in the patience he maintained when impatience would have felt more heroic. He was a man who mastered one of the hardest skills in any competitive endeavor, the ability to play the long game when the short game was calling your name. Cornwallis, by contrast, was not a bad general. He was, by many measures, an excellent one. He was aggressive, personally brave, willing to share hardship with his troops, and tactically skilled. But his strategic framework was built around the assumption that decisive battle would resolve the conflict, that if he could just corner Greene and destroy his army, the South would submit. That assumption was wrong, and Greene knew it was wrong, and he spent an entire campaign proving it wrong by simply refusing to let Cornwallis have the decisive battle on terms that would be favourable to the British. By the time Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, sealing the effective end of the Revolutionary War, the Southern theatre had already demonstrated that Britain's position in America was untenable. Greene and his ragged, persistent, unconquerable army had proven that the colonies could not be held. They had done it without winning a single, major pitched battle in the traditional sense. They had done it by being impossible to destroy, impossible to demoralize permanently, and impossible to catch when they did not want to be caught. Nathanael Greene came home from the war a hero, celebrated by his contemporaries and by Washington, who never wavered in his admiration for what Greene had accomplished. He was given land in Georgia as a gift from a grateful state, land that had been reclaimed in part through the campaign he had commanded. He died in 1786, just 43 years old, before he could see the full fruits of the republic he had helped to save. But the South was free, the British were gone, and the impossible had been accomplished by a limping ironmonger from Rhode Island who had learned everything he knew from books and had the genius and the discipline to actually use it when the moment demanded. The next time someone tells you that you have to meet force with force, that retreat is failure, that losing means you are losing, remember Nathanael Greene. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to give ground, exhaust your enemy, and come back when they least expect it. The man who won by losing is still one of the most instructive strategists in American history, and the British army that chased him through the swamps of Carolina found out the hard way that being outrun can be just as devastating as being outfought.